Somewhere along a riverbank in the foothills of the Himalayas, roughly 10,000 years ago, a wild vine was doing something that had nothing to do with feeding anyone. It was sprawling, reaching across damp soil, climbing anything vertical it could find, producing small, bitter, seed-packed fruit that existed for one purpose only: to survive. That plant is the ancestor of every cucumber growing in a backyard garden today, and it still remembers where it came from. Every instinct your cucumber plant has this summer: when to flower, how much water it demands, what it does when the heat climbs past, what it can tolerate. All of it is inherited from a vine that never once grew in a raised bed, never once had a gardener standing over it with a hose. That inheritance is the reason so much of what feels like reasonable summer care actually works against the plant. Not because the advice is careless, because the advice was written for a generic garden, and the cucumber in front of you is running software that is 10,000 years old. Today, I want to walk through the handful of things gardeners routinely do in the hottest months that quietly undercut a cucumber plant's own biology. And more importantly, I want you to understand the mechanism behind each one, not just the fix. The reason the fix works, because once you understand what the plant is actually responding to, you stop guessing every July and start reading the vine the way it's trying to be read. There's a detail buried in how cucumbers move water through their tissue in extreme heat that most articles get completely backwards, and I'm going to save it for the middle of this because it changes how you'll think about watering schedules for good. Let's start with the foundation everything else builds on. A cucumber fruit is close to 96% water. Sit with that number for a second. Almost every ounce of the vegetable sitting on your cutting board came directly out of the soil, moved up through the stem, and settled into cell walls that had to expand fast enough to keep pace with a fruit that can grow an inch a day in peak season. That is an enormous, continuous plumbing job, and it depends entirely on a steady, predictable supply of moisture, not a flood on Sunday and drought by Thursday. Steady. Here's where the first mistake shows up. Most gardeners water cucumbers the way they water everything else in the yard: shallow and frequent, a quick pass with the hose most evenings. That habit trains roots to stay near the surface, where soil temperature swings hardest and moisture evaporates fastest. In cool spring weather, that's forgivable. In July, with soil surface temperatures climbing past 100 degrees on a sunny afternoon, a shallow root system is living through a heat wave with no insulation. What the plant actually needs in summer is the opposite rhythm: one deep soaking that puts an inch to an inch and a half of water into the ground, delivered slowly enough to reach 8 to 10 inches down, 2 to 3 times a week depending on your soil. Sandy soil drains fast and needs the higher end of that range. Clay holds water longer and needs less, applied more slowly so it doesn't run off the surface. During a genuine heat wave, temperatures sitting above 90 for several consecutive days, that number can climb toward 2 inches a week. But the frequency stays the same. You're not watering more often. You're watering deeper, less often, and giving the roots a reason to grow down into cooler, more stable soil instead of staying shallow and vulnerable. Mulch is the part of this that gets skipped constantly, and it shouldn't be. 2 to 3 inches of straw, shredded leaves, or wood chips around the base of the vine does 2 jobs simultaneously. It slows evaporation from the soil surface, which means the deep watering you just did actually lasts, and it keeps root zone temperature several degrees cooler than bare soil, sitting in direct sun. A cucumber root system working in soil that stays under 85 degrees behaves completely differently than one baking at 105. It keeps functioning. It keeps taking up calcium, nitrogen, potassium, all of it, instead of shutting down and triggering the stress response we're about to get into. Now here's the piece about water movement I mentioned. Blossom end rot, that sunken, leathery brown-black patch at the base of the fruit, gets blamed on calcium deficiency almost universally. Gardeners go buy calcium supplements, crushed eggshells, lime, all of it, and pour it into soil that in most cases already has plenty of calcium sitting in it. The real failure isn't usually the amount of calcium in the ground. It's the plant's ability to move that calcium to where the fruit is actively growing. And calcium travels through a plant, exclusively in water. It doesn't relocate itself the way sugars do. If the water supply is inconsistent, if the plant goes through a dry stretch and then gets flooded, the calcium that reaches the leaves gets prioritized there. Because leaves are transpiring and pulling water hard. The fruit, further down the transport chain and transpiring far less, gets shorted. That's why blossom end rot shows up in gardens with perfectly adequate soil calcium right after an irregular watering week. The fix was never in the soil, it was in the schedule. Consistency solves what supplements usually can't. That single insight, that irregular watering disrupts internal transport rather than external supply, is worth carrying into everything else we're about to cover. Because the same principle shows up again in how the plant decides whether to produce more fruit at all. Overhead watering deserves its own moment here, because it's a habit almost every new gardener starts with, and almost every experienced grower abandons. Running a sprinkler or spraying the whole plant down from above feels thorough. It looks like you're giving the vine a good soaking. What it actually does is leave foliage wet for hours, sometimes overnight if you water in the evening. And that wet leaf window is exactly the environment, fungal and bacterial, pathogens need to establish. Angular leaf spot, downy mildew, several forms of blight. All of them get a foothold, specifically during the hours leaves stay damp without drying. Water at the base of the plant instead, early in the morning, so that any incidental splash on lower leaves has the entire day to dry in sun and airflow. If you're growing on a trellis, this becomes almost a non-issue, because vertical foliage dries faster than a sprawling mat of leaves lying against warm, humid soil. Which brings us to the second major mistake. Letting cucumber vines sprawl across the ground through the hottest part of summer feels natural, because that's exactly what the wild ancestor did along that riverbank. But your garden isn't a riverbank with unlimited room and no pathogen pressure building up season after season in the same soil. A sprawling vine traps humidity at ground level, where it's already warmest and most stagnant. Fruit, sitting directly on soil, develops soft spots and rot far more often than fruit hanging in open air. Pest pressure concentrates there too. Cucumber, beetles, and slugs both prefer the cover a low, dense vine provides overexposed, vertical growth. Training the vine up a trellis, cattle panel, netting, whatever structure you've got, does more than save space. It exposes every leaf to airflow and sunlight. It lets you actually see fruit forming before it's overripe and hidden under a canopy, and it interrupts the exact humid microclimate that fungal disease depends on. If you've been letting your cucumbers run flat across the bed, because that's how the seed packet photo showed it, this is the season to change that. Now let's talk about feeding, because this is where good intentions cause some of the most predictable damage. Nitrogen makes a plant look thriving fast. Dark green leaves, vigorous vine growth, the visual signature of a healthy garden. So when a cucumber plant looks like it's struggling in the heat, the instinct is to feed it something nitrogen-heavy and give it a boost. In cucurbits specifically, that instinct backfires. A cucumber plant under mild stress, and I mean mild, not scorched and wilting, actually produces more female flowers, the ones that become fruit, as part of its own survival strategy. It's an ancient signal. Conditions are getting harder, so prioritize reproduction now while there's still a chance. I push a heavy dose of nitrogen into that same plant, and you tip the balance the other direction. You get a vine that grows aggressively, throws mostly male flowers, and produces a fraction of the fruit it would have otherwise. All that vigorous green growth is coming at the direct expense of what you actually planted the thing for. The practical version of this is simple. Feed moderately at planting to establish the vine. Then, once flowering begins, shift toward a fertilizer lower in nitrogen and higher in phosphorus and potassium, the nutrients that support flower and fruit development, rather than leaf and stem expansion. If your vine already looks lush, deep green, sprawling with vigor but light on fruit. Stop feeding nitrogen entirely for a few weeks and watch what happens to flower ratio. More often than not, the plant redirects on its own. There's a mistake connected to this one that almost nobody talks about, and it involves the fruit itself rather than the vine. Cucumbers contain a compound called cucurbitacin, concentrated most heavily near the stem end, and it's the reason an occasional cucumber tastes sharply bitter, even when the rest of the harvest is fine. Heat stress and inconsistent watering both increase cucurbitacin production, which means the exact conditions we've already been discussing: shallow watering, irregular deep soaks, root systems, overheating, and unmulched soil are the same conditions that make your harvest taste worse. But there's a second driver that has nothing to do with stress and everything to do with a habit most gardeners fall into without noticing: letting fruit sit on the vine too long. Past picking size doesn't just make the cucumber larger and seedier, it signals to the plant that its reproductive job for that fruit is finished, which slows the production of new flowers elsewhere on the vine. Harvesting frequently, every day or two during peak season, does two things simultaneously. It keeps the fruit you're actually eating smaller, less bitter, and better textured, and it keeps the plant continuously flowering because it hasn't yet felt it accomplished its purpose. A cucumber vine, picked lightly, once a week, will almost always underperform one picked constantly, even in identical soil and weather. I want to pause on something honest here, because not every problem in a cucumber patch traces back to gardener error. Pollination failure is common in midsummer, and it isn't always something you did wrong. Most traditional slicing and pickling varieties need bee visits to set fruit, since they produce separate male and female flowers and rely entirely on an insect to move pollen between them. If you notice small yellow fruit forming and then shriveling before they ever size up, that's usually an unpollinated flower, not a disease and not a nutrient problem. A few things make this worse without gardeners realizing it. Spraying any insecticide, even one marketed as organic, during daylight hours while flowers are open, kills the exact pollinators you need. So if you must treat a pest problem, do it in the evening, after bees have finished foraging for the day, once flowers have often closed for the night. Planting a single cucumber vine, in isolation, far from other flowering plants, also reduces bee traffic simply because there's less reason for pollinators to visit that part of the garden. Interplanting with bee-attracting flowers nearby, or hand-pollinating with a small brush in the early morning when flowers are freshly open, solves this reliably if it's been a recurring issue. If you're growing one of the newer parthenocarpic varieties, often labeled for greenhouse or container growing, none of this applies, because those plants set fruit without pollination at all. It's worth knowing which type you planted before you spend a summer troubleshooting a problem that variety was specifically bred not to have. Every one of these mistakes traces back to the same root cause, if you'll forgive the pun. A cucumber vine is still running the decision-making logic of a wild plant that had to gamble on reproduction under unpredictable conditions. Water inconsistency, heat stress, nitrogen excess. They all get read by that ancient signaling system as information about how urgently the plant should be trying to survive versus reproduce, and the plant adjusts accordingly, sometimes in ways that directly reduce the harvest you were hoping for. Understanding that isn't just a piece of trivia. It's the difference between fighting your garden every July and working with a system that's actually far more responsive to good information than most gardening advice gives it credit for. If content like this is useful to you, the kind that explains the actual mechanism instead of just handing you a rule to follow, this channel is built around exactly that approach. Every week, for whatever's growing in your garden next. There's one exception worth naming before we close, because nuance matters more than a tidy rule. Container-grown cucumbers behave differently than anything we've just covered. Containers heat up and dry out far faster than garden soil, sometimes needing water daily in serious summer heat rather than the 2 to 3 times a week rhythm that works in the ground. And they benefit from partial afternoon shade in climates where ground-grown vines would tolerate full sun without issue. If you're growing in pots on a patio or balcony, adjust everything here toward more frequent, still deep watering. And don't assume a technique built for raised beds transfers directly to a 15-gallon container sitting on concrete that radiates heat back up into the root zone all afternoon. What all of this adds up to is a shift in how you look at the vine itself. Not as a plant that needs constant intervention to survive summer, but as a system that has been reading environmental signals and adjusting its own behavior for longer than agriculture has existed. Water it deeply and consistently, and it stops treating drought as an imminent threat. Keep it off the ground and let it breathe, and it stops needing to fight disease, the pressure it was never built to face in the first place. Feed it with restraint once it starts flowering, and it puts its energy where you actually want it. Pick what it offers you regularly, and it keeps offering more. None of that requires a single product from a shelf. It requires paying attention to a plant that, 10,000 years later, is still telling you exactly what it needs, if you know what you're listening for.